The day began like any other in the modest suburban town where the gym stood, its brick walls humming with the echoes of punches against pads and the grunts of determined athletes pushing themselves to the limit. A place where dreams of martial excellence were forged under the sharp eyes of instructors who demanded respect, focus, and dedication. Yet, on this particular day, the air carried a different kind of electricity, one that would soon draw everyone in the gym into an unforgettable spectacle. For among the rows of seasoned fighters, disciplined students, and confident black belts, there walked in a simple woman, an unassuming figure dressed plainly, with no visible signs of strength or combat prowess. A woman whose presence drew more curiosity than respect, because in a world obsessed with appearances and reputations, she looked like someone who didn't belong, someone who might have wandered in by mistake. Yet beneath her quiet gaze and humble smile lay a depth no one could predict. She was introduced to the class by the gym manager as just a new member seeking fitness, not competition, and she quietly bowed to the sensei as the others sized her up, some with polite nods, others with smirks of amusement. And it wasn't long before whispers filled the room, questions of why someone like her would step into a martial arts dojo where strength and skill were displayed like badges of honor. Among those watching was Darren, a young but cocky black belt, tall, broad, shouldered, with a swagger in his step that betrayed both his talent and his arrogance, for he was used to dominating sparring sessions, intimidating newcomers, and basking in the admiration of his peers. And when his eyes landed on the simple woman, he saw not a fellow student, but an opportunity, an easy way to demonstrate his superiority, to impress those around him by showing just how wide the gulf was between a trained martial artist and someone who looked like she had never thrown a punch in her life. So with a grin and a condescending tone, he approached her, suggesting that she spar with him, couching the challenge as a friendly match but dripping with the expectation that she would decline or be embarrassed if she accepted. The gym fell silent, students pausing mid-drill to watch the exchange, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others whispering that Darren had gone too far. Yet curiosity held them rooted, eager to see what would happen next, and to their astonishment, the simple woman accepted without hesitation, her voice calm and steady, her expression betraying neither fear nor excitement. Only a quiet resolve that unsettled Darren more than he cared to admit. Still, he brushed it off with a laugh, flexing his muscles as he tied his belt tighter and prepared for the spar, the audience now gathering closer, eager to witness what they assumed would be a one-sided display, a predictable outcome where a black belt would dominate a novice, and whispers rippled through the room about how unfair the challenge was, how foolish she must be, how this was going to end badly. Yet no one stopped it, for there was something magnetic in the way she carried herself, something that made even the most skeptical wait in anticipation. The sensei, though uneasy, gave a reluctant nod, allowing the match to proceed, perhaps curious himself about why this woman seemed so unshaken. And as the two bowed and took their stances on the mat, the entire gym seemed to hold its breath, the sounds of training replaced by a heavy silence, broken only by the faint creak of the mats beneath their feet. And in that moment, though no one realized it yet, the stage was set for a lesson that would echo far beyond the walls of the gym, a lesson about humility, about strength hidden in simplicity, and about the fact that appearances can deceive in ways both profound and unforgettable. As Darren adjusted his stance, bouncing lightly on the balls of his feet with the confidence of someone who had sparred dozens of times before, his eyes flickered with amusement at the woman who stood across from him, her posture unassuming, her hands not raised in the typical guard position that every martial artist drilled into habit, but rather relaxed, as though she were simply waiting for something, and that quiet stillness unsettled him more than the loudest war cry ever could. Yet his pride refused to acknowledge the unease that tugged at his instincts, because in his mind this was nothing more than a formality, a quick demonstration that would have everyone laughing and clapping at his skill when he landed a few clean strikes and forced her to yield. But as the sensei called for the match to begin, it was not Darren who set the pace, but the woman who moved with a subtle shift that was almost imperceptible, a slight pivot of her foot, a gentle lowering of her shoulders, calm adjustment that spoke of control rather than hesitation, and when Darren lunged forward with a quick jab, expecting to test her reflexes, his fist cut through the air and met nothing, for she had simply leaned back, not with panic or clumsy retreat, but with precision, as though she had known exactly where his strike would land before he even threw it, and the watching crowd, expecting a collision, gasped as Darren stumbled forward slightly, his balance compromised not because of her attack, but because of his own overconfidence. Embarrassed, he reset, forcing a grin as though it were all part of warming up, then came in faster, throwing a combination of strikes that should have overwhelmed any beginner, yet each one was met with the same unnerving ease. Her body slipping just outside the line of attack, her movements economical, efficient, wasting no energy yet evading everything he hurled at her, and with every miss his frustration grew, his swings sharper, his breath louder, his control slipping as the simple woman's calm seemed to mock him without a single word spoken. The audience, once expectant of her defeat, now leaned forward in disbelief, murmurs spreading as they realized she had not even struck back once, and yet Darren had not so much as grazed her, their eyes widening as they began to wonder who exactly this woman was, and whether her quiet demeanor had hidden something far greater than they imagined, while Darren, his pride pricked and his reputation, now hanging on the outcome, pressed harder, launching a high kick meant to display both his flexibility and his dominance, only to find his leg gently redirected by a mere touch of her hand, not blocked with brute force, but guided away as though his power meant nothing. And as he stumbled to regain balance, she stepped in close for the first time, her movements so fluid it seemed almost graceful, and with a flick of her wrist, she tapped his shoulder in a way that should have been harmless, yet somehow sent him sprawling onto the mat with a thud that echoed through the gym, silencing the whispers and leaving mouths agape. Darren scrambled up, face flushed red with both exertion and humiliation, convinced it had been a fluke, yet deep inside a seed of doubt had been planted, because what he had just felt was no accident. It was control, mastery, the kind of skill that took years to cultivate, the kind that turns strength against itself. And as he squared off again, the simple woman merely tilted her head slightly, her calm eyes studying him not as an opponent to crush, but as a student to correct, a gaze that struck deeper than any punch, because it made him feel suddenly small, suddenly raw, suddenly exposed, as though his black belt, his pride, his bravado meant nothing in front of her quiet presence. The sensei, watching intently, now leaned forward with a frown of recognition, as though some memory stirred in him about techniques, too, refined to belong to an amateur. And whispers began to ripple again among the students, speculating whether she was trained, whether she was holding back, whether they were witnessing something extraordinary hidden in plain sight. But before any conclusion could be reached, Darren charged again with desperation, throwing a wild flurry that abandoned form for sheer force. And once again she moved, not with speed but with timing, slipping through the gaps of his chaos. And in a single smooth motion, she pivoted, redirected his arm, and let his own momentum carry him into another tumble across the mat, leaving him gasping in shock as the crowd erupted in astonished murmurs, their disbelief transforming into awe as the realization dawned that the simple woman was anything but ordinary, and Darren, lying on the mat staring up at the ceiling lights, felt for the first time in his life that he was not the predator but the prey, humbled by a force he could not comprehend, as the gym around them grew charged with a new kind of silence, not of skepticism, but of reverence, waiting to see just how deep her hidden strength truly went. Darren's chest rose and fell rapidly as he pushed himself back to his feet, his hands trembling slightly, not from physical exhaustion, but from the unsettling realization that every ounce of skill he had proudly displayed was being dismantled by a woman who had yet to break a sweat, and though the room buzzed with shock, awe, and a creeping respect, Darren's pride refused to let him stop, for in his mind, surrendering to her was not just losing a spar, it was losing his identity, the reputation he had cultivated for years as the gym's fiercest competitor, the black belt who others looked up to, and so he came forward again, this time slower, measured, trying to mask his desperation under the guise of strategy, his eyes darting to her feet, her shoulders, searching for a weakness. But the simple woman remained unreadable, standing with the kind of composure that belonged not to a novice, but to a master who had seen countless fights, her breathing steady, her gaze unflinching, her very presence suffocating in its quiet dominance. The crowd whispered furiously now, some insisting she had to be an experienced martial artist hiding her rank, others speculating that perhaps she had trained in secret, that maybe she was a retired competitor, while the older sensei, watching them, grew stiller by the second, his brows furrowed as recognition dawned in fragments, for in the woman's movements he saw echoes of techniques that belonged to a very old lineage, a style not commonly taught, one that emphasized flow, redirection, and psychological control over brute strength, a style he himself had glimpsed in his younger years but had never fully mastered. And suddenly he remembered rumors of a prodigy who had once trained abroad, a woman whose skill surpassed most men in her field, but who had mysteriously vanished from the competitive circuit years ago. His eyes narrowed as he watched her pivot around Darren's next lunge, her body language effortless, like water shifting around rock, and in that moment the sensei knew she was no beginner but someone extraordinary who had chosen anonymity for reasons of her own. Meanwhile, Darren's frustration grew unbearable, as every strike he launched was either absorbed, redirected, or made irrelevant by her uncanny timing, and finally driven by rage, he let out a roar and attempted a tackle, lowering his body and charging forward with raw force. The kind of reckless move that might have worked against a true novice, but she simply stepped aside, hooked his momentum with the slightest twist of her hip, and sent him sprawling face first into the mat again, this time harder, his body skidding as gasps erupted across the gym. This time, however, she did not wait for him to rise, instead kneeling gracefully beside him and placing a gentle hand on his shoulder, not to pin him in aggression, but to still him with authority, her voice soft but carrying across the stunned silence of the gym as she said, "You rely too much on strength and speed, but strength is nothing without control, and speed is nothing without patience." Her words not meant to humiliate, but to teach. Yet to Darren they cut deeper than any blow, because in that instant he realized she saw through him. Not just his technique, but his character, his pride, his immaturity, and all the false bravado he had wrapped himself in. For the first time, Darren could not meet his opponent's eyes, his confidence shattered, and he lay there panting as she stood, and bowed slightly to the sensei, a gesture of respect that only deepened the mystery of her identity, and the gym erupted into hushed conversations, students asking aloud who she was, why she had hidden her ability, and whether they had just witnessed something historic. The sensei finally stepped forward, his voice steady though his heart raced, and asked her directly, "Tell me, where did you train?" A question loaded with reverence, suspicion, and the weight of recognition, and for the first time the woman's serene expression flickered with something else, a trace of memory, perhaps even sorrow, as she replied simply, "Long ago, under a teacher who asked me not to fight for glory but for balance." Her words vague yet profound, leaving the audience more curious than ever. But what struck everyone most was the way she carried herself, not boasting, not gloating over her victory against Darren, but speaking as if the fight had never been about winning at all, as if it were merely a conversation between two spirits, one young and brash, the other seasoned and quiet. And in that moment, the gym realized they had been silenced not by violence, but by wisdom wrapped in action. Darren, still kneeling, finally lowered his head, muttering a strained apology more to himself than to her, acknowledging without pride that he had been wrong to underestimate her. And though his defeat stung bitterly, something in him shifted, a seed of humility planted by her presence, while the others around the mat felt a similar awakening, as though the gym itself had been humbled by the lesson, and all eyes remained fixed on the woman who had entered as a stranger, but now stood as something far greater, a silent storm who had shown that simplicity can hide the deepest strength, leaving everyone desperate to know what more she might reveal. The gym remained wrapped in silence, as the simple woman, no longer just a nameless figure in plain clothes, but a force who had single-handedly shifted the balance of the entire room, stood quietly on the mat, her hands folded before her, her expression serene as though nothing remarkable had happened. Yet the atmosphere buzzed with awe and unspoken questions, the students whispering to one another, the black belts exchanging uncertain glances, and the humbled Darren still kneeling, struggling to process how everything he thought he knew about martial arts had just been dismantled in front of an audience that once admired him. The sensei, who had been watching her with sharp, searching eyes, finally stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority that usually demanded obedience but now laced with an unusual reverence. And he bowed deeply to her, stunning the entire gym into silence once more, for no student had ever seen the sensei bow so respectfully to another. And when he rose, his words revealed what many had already suspected. You are no beginner, and you never were. I recognize the discipline in your movements, the patience in your steps. You are of the old school, aren't you? And for the first time since entering the gym, the woman allowed herself a faint smile, the kind that seemed both kind and heavy with memory, and she spoke softly. I trained once, yes, but not for competition, not for belts or trophies. My teacher was a man who believed that the art was not about defeating others, but about defeating the chaos within ourselves, and he taught me that one day I might have to remind others of this truth. Today, it seems, was that day, her words landing in the room like stones in still water, rippling through the minds of everyone listening, each syllable cutting deeper than any strike, for they carried the weight of philosophy and experience that transcended sport, and suddenly the gym's purpose felt shallow compared to the depth of her message. Students who had come for fitness or belts shifted uncomfortably as they realized how much of their practice had been about appearance and ego, while the black belts felt a flush of shame for ever looking down on her, and Darren himself finally stood, his head bowed, and with trembling honesty he asked, "Will you teach me?" A plea that surprised everyone, for Darren had never asked anyone for guidance with humility before, yet the simple woman only shook her head, gently answering, "You already have a teacher, respect him, learn from him, and more importantly, learn from your defeats, for defeat is the doorway to growth." And though her refusal stung, it carried with it a dignity that made her words impossible to resent, for she had not humiliated Darren, but instead given him something far more valuable, a path forward, stripped of arrogance, built on humility. The sensei, still watching her with deep respect, nodded slowly, and in that moment he understood what she had come for, not to show off, not to belittle anyone, but to plant a seed of change, a reminder that martial arts was not a sport for egos, but a practice of discipline, patience, and balance. And as the students bowed to her, some with tears of shame in their eyes, others with newfound admiration, she returned the gesture with the same quiet humility she had carried from the beginning, as if she were simply another student among them. And then, without fanfare, she gathered her simple bag, slipped her shoes back on, and walked toward the door, leaving behind a silence thicker than thunder, for the gym had been shaken to its core. Whispers followed her out, not of mockery, but of reverence, as though they had just witnessed a legend in disguise, and even after the door closed behind her, the energy she left lingered, hanging in, the air like incense after a ritual, impossible to ignore. In the days that followed, Darren changed. He no longer boasted, no longer sparred with arrogance, but trained with humility, often recalling the words she spoke and the lesson he had learned in front of everyone, and the gym itself shifted, with students practicing not just for strength, but for understanding. Their respect for one another deepened, their discipline sharpened. All because of the example of a woman who never gave her name, never claimed a title, and never sought applause. Rumors began to spread in the martial arts community about the mysterious figure who had silenced an entire gym, each retelling painting her as a ghost of the old traditions, a reminder of what martial arts was truly meant to be. And though no one knew where she'd come from or where she went, her presence became a legend, her story told to every new student as a warning against arrogance and as an inspiration to seek balance rather than dominance. And perhaps that was her greatest victory, not the ease with which she defeated a black belt, not the skill she displayed, but the way she left behind a legacy of humility, discipline, and quiet strength that would echo in the hearts of those who had witnessed it for years to come, ensuring that the gym, once filled with chatter and pride, would never forget the day a simple woman walked in and without force or fame, silenced the whole room with nothing but the truth of her art.